Assalamualaikum and a very good day to Professor Piscatori and all the viewers of ILF channel. So today we are having our discussion on religious rights vis-a-vis human rights. So there were many discussions, many debates and many questions that I believe are still unanswered in terms of the debate between human rights itself in the Western corpus itself and in the Islamic scholarship itself. So the common line, Professor Piscatori, the common line of the debate between human rights and religious rights is we always assume that in a multicultural society, we need to secure human rights so that all the different belief, people with different convictions could live together peacefully and harmoniously. And that is already an embedded assumption that some interpretation or rather misinterpretation of any conviction could lead to jeopardizing human rights. So, however, Professor Piscatori, this is my first question. This leads to the first question. There is also a possibility that the commitment to human rights could also jeopardize religious rights. For example, in the context of multicultural society, it has been argued, and I think this has been in the debate of multiculturalism in political theory. For example, in the liberal political structure, we say that the state is neutral. However, there will be certain religious groups or certain groups which, which needs to have some assistance of the state to exist. For example, if the state stay neutral, for example, that group could not survive, or that group will perish, and that will indirectly jeopardize the right to exist. So what is the state in this sense? If the state is to intervene, the state will then deprive certain kind of rights of this group. So I think that is still a contention right now. So where do you locate this debate, Professor?
It's the major question, of course, before all of these debates that we have about human rights and religious rights, etc. I think that it's always a question of trying to get a balance, and this is very difficult to do. Now, you quite rightly say that in theories of multiculturalism and even in theories about secularism, the state should be neutral. But this is easier said than done. It becomes very difficult to actually do that. And I think, I think you rightly point out that the neutrality is more an aspiration than a reality. That no matter what we're talking about, we talk about states as if they were very abstract things. Most of the time, of course, what we really mean are the political elites that control this institution called the state. Now, those elites either themselves are identified with certain religious or ideological backgrounds, or are willing to promote others who have them, so that there isn't that kind of neutrality in fact. But at the end of the day, given that that's just a fact of life, what we hope for is that they're able not to overly identify with a particular group or a vested interest, but maybe to be able to moderate the differences between them. That would be the ideal. Now, in reality, I mean, that would be the best we could probably attain in the real world, rather than the ideal, but it's the best that we could do. But that ability to arbitrate and balance off these various groups is a very delicate maneuver. And again, it largely depends on how strong are the individual groups. So are they able to, by themselves, to exert influence or power? And of course, who in the elite are we really talking about? Are they themselves willing to sort of compromise and accept? If they're closed-minded, then there's a problem.
So we have been talking about compromising, we have been talking about tolerating.
Yes.
So, however, there is also another question regarding to tolerance, because what is the limit of tolerance? Because we always argue that different groups should tolerate each other, and the
Yes.
political structure should be neutral. Therefore, a liberal political structure is inevitable or is desirable
Yes.
in this sense.
Yes.
However, there is a contention of human rights identified with any communitarian rights, for example,
Yes.
which could jeopardize the right of a liberal political structure.
Exactly.
For example.
Yes.
So how do we, in envisaging the structure of a neutral liberal structure, should go about this?
Again, there's no simple answer to this. I think you put your finger on it, though, by saying that we do have a problem sometimes of almost a too enthusiastic interpretation of human rights. Professor Faruqi, in the workshop that we've just had on this subject, I think made a point about that human rights itself has become a religion. And I see what he means. Now, in the sense that people would argue that human rights have to be implemented no matter what and in all circumstances, as if it's a level playing field, as if it's blank slate. But as we've been saying, it's not. It's not. So therefore, there's got to be some sort of acceptance that they are important, they ought to be implemented, but they can't be absolute either. And I suppose the question that has come to the fore in much of the media and even academic discussions has to do with freedom of expression. And the case of the cartoons depicting the Prophet, of course, has raised this question in a very direct way. So is it an absolute right to say what you want? I very much agree with what the panel had said in this meeting, which is that there is no absolute freedom of expression. By implication, therefore, there isn't an absolute application of human rights, which I know runs counter to the large narrative, the liberal narrative about human rights. But it's the ideal of human rights hitting the realities, cultural difference, etc. And there has to be some give there, some leeway. But where the line is drawn, I think, cannot be done abstractly.
So, building on your remark about traditional Islam that we had just now, because I've been reading Said Hussein Nasser, and I've been immersed in his argument about traditional Islam can be one force that could face the challenge of modernity.
Yes.
So, because this argument, I know it has some considerable force, because in traditional Islam itself, for example, in Iran, they could build a foundation of human rights based on that.
Exactly.
So, for example, what happened in the Sunni tradition, for example, because we have looked at what happened in Qom, but in the Sunni tradition, we have Wahhabi, we have fundamentalism. This term understood as people who misinterpreted Islam in a very, very crass way. Yeah.
Those are one dimension. That's one part of Sunni Islam. And by the way, you could say the same thing about Shiism as well. That there is a kind of a very puritanical interpretation of any religion. And so the Wahhabis, etc., would be in that tradition. But so they always develop, and they always do because they presume to speak on behalf of the ideology or the belief system, in this case, of Islam. But in many ways, what we're talking about is the ability to respond to the circumstances of modernity, etc. I think the traditional Islam argument is very powerful in two ways. First, they, as Sayyid Hussein Nasser himself in his work would show, and others, there are certain core principles that become important for the development of what we would call Islam, and traditional Islam. Those core principles over time have become stretched, have become institutionalized, in some cases distorted.
And it is reducing certain of its values.
Yes, exactly. And so in a way, this is the same kind of impulse of the Salafis, but taken in a different direction. There's nothing wrong with going back to first principles. That's correct. It's just that it has to be, how are those first principles interpreted? And I think that the rationalist tradition that is embedded, particularly in Sunni Islam, allows us to see that the first principles would give us ideas which are compatible with the conditions of modernity. So I very much endorse that argument that one can do that. So that's in terms of the power of the ideas themselves. The second argument is more functionalist. It's more
utilitarian.
Yes, it's how to get the ideas across. So it is easier and more effective to sell your message, package it, by using terms which would have a resonance, which would mean something to the society. So insofar as you invoke those ideas and perhaps interpret it in a certain modern way, it helps to sell them. It helps to get it across. So there's a kind of a double value to it. But very definitely, I would argue that it occurs.
So do you see that the modern education which came out of the Industrial Revolution jeopardized the nature of traditional Islamic scholarship in one way or another?
No. No, I don't. And I think that, the argument is often made that modern education, in a way, inspires secularism, inspires materialism, etc. Okay, my argument would be that modern education, first of all, gives you the tools by which you can then go back and interpret the basic texts. And so one of the fundamental developments of the modern period is the larger number of people who would be able to interpret the text. And I know you are going to ask me what the implications of that are, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the other bit of modern education is that in putting the emphasis on rationality, and the emphasis upon thinking, the emphasis upon that things are not done just simply because that God had ordered them to be done, but there is a certain logic to science, there's a logic to technology, etc. Insofar as modern education has unveiled that, made it transparent, then that's good, because it enhances the ability to deal with modernity, and I think it is compatible with an embedded Islamic tradition of rationalism. So it's really bringing the two traditions together rather than being anything which is against it. Now, before you ask it, let me just say my first point, when you allow for greater access to the scriptures, is this not an implicit criticism of the monopoly of the ulama? Yes. Yes, it is. In other words, it does raise the question of who is going to be able to control the scriptures, who's going to be able to control access to the religion. And modern education has given us the means by which more and more people can do that.
However, if we look at the spectrum of subjects of modern education, we could see that there is a narrowing down of subjects compared to the traditional Islamic learning. So I think even if we could say that there are more people who have the tool to go to the text,
they have a more limited view of it.
Yes. So how do you see this? I think this could also mean that there are many people who could go to the text, but there are also more narrowed down interpretations of the text.
It's a good complement to what I was saying. I think there's something to that. But it also depends on, of course, now, what are we using this information for? So if we're talking about, which I think a great deal of this is about who has the right to exercise ijtihad? Who has the right to sort of present their ideas? Here, there are certain, as Dr. Farouk has argued, there are certain ideas here like maslaha, public interest. Okay, now do I need to know all the classic sciences that would be taught in a medieval madrasa in order to be able to delineate what is the maslahah today. Maybe not. And I do understand that an argument can be made that unless you have that kind of fuller knowledge, then it's a free-for-all. Then anybody can exercise ijtihad and you lose control over it. I understand that. So I'm not saying at the end of the day that although people have greater access, not everyone should be followed. It's that we should go back to that classic principle, which is that you follow people who you believe have the ability to interpret it. So I think that is conditional upon the kind of arguments that are put forward and also the kind of piety of the individual, the reputation. You know, there's a lot in Islam that comes down to personal integrity. The integrity of the interpreter.
So yeah. So coming back to the human rights debate, especially within the Muslim majority community, we could see that the debate has been, you know, divided into those who are pro-human rights and those who are anti-human rights. So what is the main factor of the divide itself? Because we could see that this kind of using the language of human rights have been prevalent after the Western hegemony. Yeah, so there are modern Muslims who are educated in the West, and then they advocated human rights. So, but the traditional leaning Muslims who see this as one package of a whole Western idea, then refute this altogether. So, how do you see the way forward to this? Is consultation enough for them to come to terms?
Those who want to criticize it as part of, as you say, having embedded kind of cultural Western understandings, that line of thought is always going to be there. And it, of course, is in more than just the Islamic world. You hear it in other parts of the world too. So I think that is almost an inevitable dimension to the debate. People will say that. But a couple of things. One is that I think those, to a certain extent, there is going to be not an overlap where culturally defined or Islamically defined ideas will be very different from what is. So we have, in the example is often given about women's rights, but probably the best example is the one about the question of change of religion. Do you have freedom of religious choice, of conscience? And indeed, that does seem to fly in the face with much of Muslim thinking to some extent. But there, it comes down to, so they will always argue that, and I think there might be a dialogue, but it won't be resolved. It won't be resolved very easily. So we then come down to how does the Muslim world react to that? Part of them will just simply, will reinforce the kind of conservative reaction, or those who say that it is Western bias, but it will also inspire within certain Muslim circles the question, do we have something which is not compulsory? Do we have an alternative of approach? So I don't think the answer is clear. I don't think it has gelled. But maybe the reaction to that westernized view of it is forcing a kind of a greater debate. So there's a kind of a reaction to it intensifying a debate.
So,
but still the final answer not clear.
Yeah, so I would see this as all of this will boil down to education and how we educate our youth. How they look at the text and how they interpret and how they encounter each other. Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, I think education is key to all of this. I think you're right. But again, what you're implying is that it comes, what's the curriculum then of the education and who sets the curriculum?
Yeah, definitely. it comes to ideology, structure,
Exactly.
institutionalization.
So then we're back to institutionalization, we're back to all of that. And that it complicates the situation because it's a political answer to a very large extent. I mean, my perspective would be that if there could be some sort of open kind of education whereby you don't kind of prescribe that what we want you to do is we want you to grow up to be kind of a Western liberal sort of Democrat, but simply to say, here's this set of ideas, here's this set of ideas in Islam, and then you decide. You know, you work it out. Provide the tools by which students would be able to understand both sides or all sides of the debate.
So, and push for conversation.
And push for the conversation. I mean, someone in the conference said, and I think that they're correct on this, I mean, I believe that you have to have the conversation. I believe that, and that more than that, that out of the conversation, ideas are likely to take on more concrete form. Sometimes they won't be good. Sometimes they'll be quite negative, but at least you'll be clearer in the sort of argument. Somebody in the conference said, in the forum said, yeah, but you know, you're putting so much emphasis on the conversation. In fact, there is no conversation because people are shouting at each other. And either that because there is a kind of a, you know, extreme version of the ideology which says you don't have a right to participate in this discussion, or on the other side, because the bureaucracy says, I will do it for you. I will speak for you. You don't have to do it, I'll do it. So you have, on the one hand, a kind of overly formalized taking on the ability to speak for somebody else. On the other hand, you might have a very shrill sort of shouting down of someone and delegitimizing their right to participate in the discussion. You know, in the case of Islam, you're not Muslim enough. Or you have a deviant social practice, or what is seen as deviant, and therefore you're delegitimized. If that's built into it, then you don't have a real conversation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Piscatori. I guess that's the last question for our interview today.
Thank you very much. There are no answers to any of this, but
so,
thank you for putting.
It was actually a brief tour de force from. We started from human rights, and then we go through to politics, to education, and then to institutionalization, everything, and then to conversation.
But everything is connected.
Yeah, and everything is connected, so we are doomed. So,
anyway,
thank you very much, Professor Piscatori, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank ILF and everyone who attended this forum today, and we hope that all the knowledge and all the information that we got today will come to our benefit in the future, inshallah.